The dust in the Montana Territory of the late 1870s had a taste. It was the taste of grit, of failed crops, and of forgotten promises. Clara Whitfield knew the flavor well. It coated her tongue from sunup to sundown, a constant reminder of the drought that had its boot on the neck of her small horse ranch. At 26, she was a widow, a title that sat on her shoulders as heavily as the yoke she used for carrying water from the nearly dry creek. Her land, a modest spread of rolling, thirsty hills. Was her husband Daniel's dream? Now it was just her reality. It was pressed right up against the coming thunder of the new railroad, a beast of iron and steam that devoured land with an insatiable hunger. The creek was a ghost of itself, a cracked, muddy scar where water once ran free. Her horses, usually sleek and powerful, were leaner now, their coats dull with the same dust that covered everything. Hope was a currency she could no longer afford. Debt was another matter entirely. It arrived with the regularity of the sunrise, in the form of tax notices and the predatory gaze of Sheriff Hale. He rode out that afternoon, his star a cheap glint of tin on his chest, his horse kicking up the very soil he'd come to claim. He wasn't alone. Trailing him was Jonas Pike, the son of the railroad baron whose name was a curse whispered by every small landowner in Cedar Ridge. Jonas fancied himself a gentleman, but his eyes moved over Clara's property with the cold calculation of a wolf sizing up a lamb. "Afternoon, Mrs. Whitfield," Hale said, his voice a gravelly drawl that set Clara's teeth on edge. He didn't dismount, a small act of dominance she had come to expect. "Just checking on folks. This drought's a mean one." "We're managing, Sheriff," Clara replied, her hands tightening on the worn leather of a rein she was mending. Her knuckles were raw, her fingernails chipped. She refused to let him see her weariness. Jonas Pike smiled, a flash of white teeth that didn't reach his eyes. "A woman alone has a hard time of it," he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "My father, he worries about the well-being of the citizens here. He's authorized me to make you a fair offer for this place, enough to set you up fresh somewhere else, back east. Maybe." The offer was an insult, a fraction of what the land was worth, and they all knew it. It was the railroad's way: squeeze a person until they had no choice but to break. "This is my home," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm as bedrock. "It's not for sale." Hale shifted in his saddle. "That's a shame to hear. Taxes are due. The territory doesn't take kindly to folks who don't pay their share, especially when progress is knocking at the door." He gestured with his chin toward the distant, raw gash in the earth where the tracks were being laid. Jonas leaned forward, his voice lowering into what he likely thought was a seductive whisper. "There are other ways to secure your future. Clara, a smart woman knows when to accept a partnership. A marriage can solve a great many problems." The suggestion hung in the dry air, foul and suffocating. He wasn't offering marriage. He was offering a gilded cage, and the price was her home, her freedom, her husband's memory. She met his gaze, her own clear and cold as a winter morning. "I am not in the market for a husband, Mr. Pike. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." She turned her back on them, a dismissal more powerful than any curse she could have uttered. She heard Hale spit onto the ground before they wheeled their horses around and rode off, leaving a cloud of accusation in their wake. A knot of fear tightened in her stomach. She was alone, and the wolves were circling. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. From a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley, Nantan watched them leave, his eyes dark and sharp, missed nothing. He had seen the arrogance of the man with a star and the avarice of the younger one. He had seen the woman's straight spine and the defiant set of her shoulders. He was a ghost in this landscape, a man who belonged everywhere and nowhere. His Apache name, Nantan, meant spokesman, but he had long been silent. He had worn the blue coat of an army scout, believing in the promise of a bridge between two worlds. He had learned their language, their ways, their warfare, And in return, he had watched them break every treaty, had witnessed the casual cruelty inflicted upon his people, herded like cattle onto reservations that were little more than prisons of starvation and disease. The last straw had been the forced march, the wails of the children, the blank eyes of the elders. He had shed the blue coat that day, leaving it folded on a rock in the desert, and walked away. Now he was searching for what remained of his family, a sister, a cousin, anyone who had survived the relocation. His journey had led him here, following a faint rumor, a whisper of a small group that had escaped the soldiers. He carried the weight of a survivor, a quiet sorrow that lived behind his eyes. His search had taken an unexpected turn 2 days ago. He had found tracks small, stumbling footprints beside the larger, shod hoofprints of a stolen horse, the tracks of a child. Following them, he had come to this valley, to this small ranch run by a lone white woman. And he had seen the boy, a small boy with dark hair and the unmistakable features of the people. Nantan's heart had clenched. He recognized the intricate beadwork on the boy's worn moccasins. It was the pattern of his cousin, Atsa. This was her son, Toshin, his own blood. He had watched for 2 days, his training keeping him hidden, his purpose clear. He needed to understand the situation. Was this woman a threat, a captor, or something else? He had seen her treating the boy not as a prisoner, but as a guest. He saw her give the child water before she drank herself. He saw her share her meager meal. It was a language of kindness that transcended words. Still, he remained wary. The frontier was a place of shifting allegiances and sudden violence. That evening, the world changed. The sky, a pale, washed-out blue for months, turned a sickly yellow-brown. The wind began to whisper, then to moan, then to scream. A dust storm, a true black blizzard, was rolling in from the plains. Nantan found shelter in a shallow cave, pulling his worn blanket over his head, and thought of the boy and the woman in the small wooden house below. Clara had seen it coming. She worked with a frantic energy born of experience, herding her few precious horses into the barn, securing the heavy door with a thick wooden bar. She double-checked the shutters on her small cabin, stuffing rags into the cracks around the window frames. The air grew thick, making each breath a chore. Then the storm hit. It was like being swallowed by the earth. A deafening roar filled the world, the wind shrieking like a banshee. Fine. Choking dust forced its way through every defense, coating everything, stinging her eyes, filling her lungs. The small cabin groaned under the assault. For hours, she sat in the near darkness, listening to the fury of nature, a solitary soul adrift in a sea of chaos. When the wind finally began to recede, a strange, eerie silence fell. The world outside was muted, transformed, buried under a blanket of fine silt. Clara pushed open her door, the wood scraping against a newly formed dune. The air was still thick, but breathable. It was in this surreal, orange-lit twilight that she saw it, a small shape, half buried in the dust near her well. At first, she thought it was a fallen calf, but as she drew closer, her heart leaped into her throat. It was a child, a little boy, no older than 5 or 6, curled into a tight ball, his face streaked with dirt and tears. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow. He wore the tattered remains of buckskin leggings and a simple cotton shirt. He was Apache, or part Apache. She could tell, a child of the people so feared and hated in Cedar Ridge. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at her to leave him. To take in an Apache child was to invite trouble of the worst kind. Hale would use it as the final excuse he needed. The townsfolk would call her a traitor, but then the boy coughed, a weak, rattling sound, and his small body trembled. She saw not a race, not a political problem, but a child on the brink of death. Daniel's face flashed in her mind, his kindness, his belief that a person's worth was measured by their compassion, not their fears. With a surge of resolve, she knelt, gently scooping the boy into her arms. He was lighter than a sack of flour. She carried him inside, laying him on her own bed. She washed his face with a damp cloth, her touch gentle. She dribbled a few precious drops of water between his cracked lips. He drank weakly, his dark eyes fluttering open for a moment, filled with a terror so profound it made her ache. "It's all right," she whispered. The words meant more for herself than for him. "You're safe now." For the next few days, she nursed him. He had a fever that left him delirious, but she stayed by his side, cooling his forehead, coaxing spoonfuls of thin broth into him. He spoke in a language she didn't understand, words of fear and loss. She learned his name was Toshin. He slowly began to heal. The fear in his eyes was replaced by a watchful curiosity. He followed her with his gaze as she moved about the cabin. A small, silent shadow. A tentative trust began to form, a fragile bridge built of shared meals and quiet gestures. Clara knew she had crossed a line. This boy was now her responsibility, another mouth to feed, another life to protect. And in a way she couldn't explain. His presence filled a hollow part of her heart she thought had died with Daniel. From his vantage point, Nantan watched it all. He saw the woman's tireless care. He felt a grudging respect, a flicker of gratitude that warred with a lifetime of suspicion. But he also saw the new danger. The boy's presence at the ranch was a secret that could not be kept for long. Men rode these lands who would ask no questions before putting a bullet in an Apache child. Men who collected bounties offered for renegades. One night, the moon was a sliver in the sky. Clara, unable to sleep, stared out her window into the darkness. A flicker of movement near the corral caught her eye. Her blood ran cold. A tall figure stood in the shadows, still as the stones around him. Her first thought was of Jonas Pike, or one of Hale's thugs, come to terrorize her. She reached for the shotgun she kept loaded by the door, her hands trembling. But as she watched, two other men, rough-looking drifters by their silhouette, crept from the opposite direction, their movement stealthy and predatory. They were heading for the house. Before she could even raise the gun, the lone figure moved. He was a blur of silent motion, intercepting the two men before they had taken 10 steps. There was no grand fight, no exchange of gunfire, just a confrontation of terrifying quiet. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the glint of a knife in the tall man's hand. She saw the two drifters back away, their posture shifting from predatory to fearful. They turned and practically fled into the night. The lone figure watched them go, then melted back into the shadows as if he were never there. Clara stood frozen, the heavy shotgun in her hands. She didn't understand what she had just seen. But one thing was clear: the watcher in the dark had not been a threat to her. He had been a guardian. The next morning, Sheriff Hale rode up, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He held out a piece of paper. "Official notice, Mrs. Whitfield," he announced, his voice ringing with finality. "You've got 30 days to pay your back taxes in full. If you don't, this ranch and everything on it goes up for public auction." Clara took the paper, her hand steady despite the tremor in her soul. 30 days. It was a death sentence for her home. The paper felt like a stone in her hand, dragging her down. She looked out at the parched land, at the barn that housed her future, and at the small cabin where a lost boy was finally learning to feel safe. The question was no longer just about survival. It was about justice. And in this parched, lawless land, she wondered who, if anyone, was on its side. The 30-day notice was a brand on Clara's mind, searing itself into her thoughts with every sunrise that failed to bring rain. The dust was no longer a simple nuisance. It was a shroud, slowly suffocating her ranch. The well was a muddy pit, the creek bed a map of cracked earth, her horses, the legacy Daniel had left her, were suffering. Their thirst was a silent accusation. She had no choice. The old prospectors used to talk of water high up in the granite teeth of the mountains, secret springs that defied the drought. It was a long shot, a dangerous trek into territory frequented by predators, both four-legged and two. But it was the only shot she had. She packed two of her sturdiest horses with empty barrels, her husband's old shotgun resting in a scabbard beside her saddle. Toshin watched her with wide, solemn eyes. Leaving him behind was unthinkable. He would be a helpless target. Taking him was a risk, but he was a piece of her heart now, and she wouldn't leave her heart behind. She lifted him onto her saddle, sitting him securely in front of her. He was small but sturdy, and his presence was a strange comfort, a small, warm weight against the vast emptiness of her fears. They rode for hours, climbing out of the scorched valley into the sparse pine and stubborn scrub of the foothills. The air grew thinner, cleaner. The silence was broken only by the plodding of hooves on stone and the occasional cry of a hawk circling in the vast, indifferent sky. Clara felt a constant prickle on her neck, the feeling of being watched. She scanned the ridges, her hand never far from the shotgun. She remembered the shadow that had protected her, and she wondered if he was out there now. The thought was both unsettling and oddly reassuring. By late afternoon, she heard it, a faint, impossible sound, the murmur of moving water. Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through her. She urged the horses forward, following the sound through a narrow, rocky gorge, and then she saw it. Tucked away in a moss-covered granite bowl was a small waterfall, spilling from a high crevice into a clear, deep pool. It was a miracle, a patch of Eden in a world of dust. Tears pricked her eyes. She slid from the saddle, lifting Toshin down. The boy, who had been quiet for hours, gasped at the sight of so much water, his small face breaking into a rare, beautiful smile, while the horses drank their fill, their sides heaving with gratitude. Clara splashed water on her own face, scrubbing away the layers of grit, the need to be clean, to wash away the filth and the fear of the past weeks, was an overwhelming, primal urge. She looked around. The gorge was secluded, a natural fortress of rock. Toshin was happily splashing his feet at the pool's edge. She felt safe, hidden. Unstrapping her gun belt and laying it on a rock, she quickly shed her dusty, sweat-soaked clothes, her movements urgent. The cool water was a shock, a blessing that stole her breath. She submerged herself, the water washing over her skin like a benediction, rinsing the dust from her hair. For a fleeting moment, she was not a widow, not a debtor, not a woman fighting a losing battle. She was just Clara, alive and free under the Montana sky. The snap of a twig shattered the peace. Her head whipped around. A man stood at the entrance to the gorge, frozen in place. It was the Watcher, the Protector, Nantan. He was taller than she'd realized, lean and powerful, his face a study in sharp angles and quiet intensity. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, and in them, she saw not lechery or malice, but a mirror of her own shock. He turned his back instantly, a movement so swift and decisive it was an apology in itself. The rigid line of his shoulders spoke of a profound respect for her privacy, a stark contrast to the leering eyes of Jonas Pike. Clara scrambled for the bank, her heart hammering against her ribs with a mix of shame and adrenaline. Her clothes were a dozen feet away. She was exposed, vulnerable. She crouched behind a boulder, trying to will herself invisible. She heard him move, but he did not approach. When she dared to peek, he was gone from the entrance. But on a large, flat rock near her discarded clothing lay his deerskin poncho, a silent offering of cover and dignity. A moment later, his voice came, low and steady, from beyond the entrance of the gorge. His English was slow, carefully chosen. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. I was not watching you. I was tracking others. They are gone now. You are safe. The words hung in the air. Asterisk. He was tracking others. The drifters. He had followed them, or men like them. All this way to ensure she and Toshin were out of harm's way. The shame burning in her cheeks cooled, replaced by a wave of stunned realization. This man, this Apache stranger whose society had taught her to fear, had appointed himself her silent guardian. She dressed quickly, her hands fumbling with the buttons on her shirt. When she emerged, wrapping his poncho around her shoulders for a warmth she didn't yet need, he was standing with his back to her, looking out over the valley. Toshin was at his side, looking up at him not with fear, but with a deep, instinctual recognition. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. Nantan turned, his gaze respectful, never dropping below her face. "The boy is your kin?" he asked, nodding toward Toshin. "No," she said. "I found him, after the storm." His expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, relief. Perhaps. He looked at Toshin, and for the first time spoke in the soft, flowing sounds of the Apache tongue. The boy, who had barely spoken a word to Clara, answered him immediately. A torrent of words pouring out of him. A conversation of ghosts and sorrows passed between them. A story Clara could only guess at when it was over. Nantan looked back at her. "He is my cousin's son," he said simply. "I have been searching for them." The weight of it settled on Clara. This guardian angel was not hers. He was here for the boy. The knowledge should have made her afraid, but it didn't. It made a strange, painful kind of sense. They filled the water barrels, the task creating a temporary, unspoken truce. As the sun began to dip below the mountains, a change came over the air. The temperature plummeted with an unnatural speed, the mountain air turning from cool to bitingly cold. A freak autumn chill was descending upon them. They would not make it back to the ranch before nightfall, and this cold was dangerous. They made camp in a small clearing on the edge of a pine forest. Nantan built a fire with an efficiency that seemed like magic, a small, hot blaze that fought bravely against the encroaching darkness and the penetrating cold. They ate in silence, sharing Clara's meager rations of jerky and hardtack. The firelight danced on their faces, throwing their shadows long and dark against the trees. Toshin, exhausted, huddled close to Clara, wrapped in her bedroll, and was asleep in moments. But the fire was not enough. The cold was a physical thing, a predator that gnawed at them through their clothes. Clara's teeth began to chatter. She saw Nantan, sitting stoically across the fire, was shivering almost imperceptibly, his jaw tight. To fall asleep in this cold was to risk not waking up. She knew the stories of travelers found frozen solid just feet from a dead fire. Propriety was a luxury afforded by warmth and safety. Here, it was a fool's vanity. Her survival, and more importantly, Toshin's, depended on shared body heat. Her mind raced, battling a lifetime of ingrained rules against the stark reality of their situation. Nantan seemed bound by his own code, keeping his distance, respecting a boundary she had not drawn but that was understood by them both. A widow and an Apache man. The world they came from would see only scandal, but that world was 1,000 miles away. Here, there was only the cold, the darkness, and the will to see the dawn. She had to be the one to speak. She had to give the permission. "We'll freeze if we stay like this," she said, her voice sounding loud in the silence. Nantan looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He knew what she meant. He gave a slow, single nod. She moved her bedroll next to his, close to the fire. She lay down, pulling Toshin tightly against her front. Then, taking a steadying breath, she spoke to the man beside her. "Lie with your back to mine, please, for the warmth." He moved without a word, settling behind her. A solid living wall against the cold. The heat from his body seeped through her clothes, a profound and immediate relief. But it wasn't enough. The wind picked up, slicing through their thin sanctuary. Toshin whimpered in his sleep. Clara made a choice. It wasn't born of passion or desire, but of a deeper, more fundamental need for survival, for trust, for a human anchor in a hostile world. She shifted, turning carefully to face him, keeping the sleeping child bundled between them. "This will be warmer," she whispered to the darkness. She felt him hesitate for a fraction of a second, a tension in his body that spoke of his own internal conflict. Then he relaxed. He shifted, drawing her and the boy closer, his arm coming around them to cocoon them in the bedrolls. It was not the embrace of a lover, but of a protector. He tucked the blankets in around her shoulders, his movements sure and impersonal. She rested her head on his chest, the rough wool of his shirt against her cheek. She could hear the steady, slow beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was the sound of life, of strength, of honor, and for the first time in a long, long time, she felt completely safe. The promise of the title was fulfilled not in lust, but in a simple, profound truth. She let him hold her, willingly, so they might all live to see the morning. The dawn came, pale and gray, the cold finally broken by the weak sunlight. They moved apart with a shared, unspoken understanding, a new intimacy hanging between them that was deeper than a touch. As Clara began to pack their meager camp, her hands stiff with cold, she checked the straps on Daniel's old saddle. The rough journey had worked a seam loose on the saddle skirt. Annoyed, she picked at it, and her fingers brushed against something hard and flat tucked deep inside the leather lining. Her brow furrowed. She worked her fingers into the hidden slit and pulled. It was a small rectangle of oilcloth, folded tightly. With trembling hands, she unwrapped it. Inside was a hand-drawn map, rendered in Daniel's precise, familiar hand. It was a map of their ranch, but it showed things she had never seen. Lines and symbols marking rock formations, and a single, blue line that ran from the mountains, deep underground, directly beneath her property. At the bottom, a note was scrawled in his handwriting, asterisk, "The heart of the valley runs deep. Clara, never forget that. Asterisk." It was a map to an underground river, an aquifer, a secret source of water, hidden beneath the parched earth. It was life, it was hope, it was the key to saving everything. She stared at it, the fragile paper a testament from her dead husband, delivered to her by a journey forced upon her by desperation, and survived by the trust of a stranger. Trust, she was learning, wasn't built on grand promises. It was seated in the smallest of actions, a turned back, a gifted poncho, and the shared warmth against a killing cold. The map was a secret fire in Clara's pocket. On the long, quiet ride back to the ranch, its presence was a constant, almost physical warmth against her thigh. It was a promise from a ghost, a lifeline from a world that no longer existed. But Daniel's promise couldn't pay taxes. The water, if it was even there, was a future solution to a present crisis. The 30-day notice was the only reality that mattered. Nantan moved around her ranch with a quiet economy of motion that made him seem a part of the landscape. He had not asked to stay, and she had not asked him to leave. Their shared night of survival in the mountains had forged an unspoken pact. He was here for Toshin. She knew, but his gaze also took in the broken fences, the thirsty horses, the 100 small struggles of her daily life. He mended a sagging corral gate with rawhide strips so tight they sang when plucked. He found a patch of stubborn winter grass in a sheltered ravine that she had overlooked. He did not speak of these things. They were simply done. "I have to sell the yearlings," she announced one evening, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. They were sitting by the fire pit outside her cabin. Toshin was asleep inside. The yearlings were her best stock, Daniel's pride, the future of the Whitfield brand. Selling them was like selling off pieces of her own hope. Nantan looked at her from across the flames. He didn't offer pity or platitudes. He simply nodded, his eyes reflecting the fire. "They will need to be cleaned." He said, "A good coat brings a better price." The next 2 weeks were a blur of hard labor. Together, they worked to get the small herd of 6 young horses ready. Nantan, it turned out, had a gift with them. He moved with a calm patience that soothed their skittish energy. He taught her how to use a curry comb made from a gourd to bring a shine to their dusty coats. They worked in a comfortable silence, a rhythm of shared purpose that needed no words. Clara found herself watching him, the sure way he handled the animals, the straightness of his back, the dignity that clung to him like a second skin. She was no longer just a woman alone. She was a woman with an ally, and the distinction was as profound as finding water in the desert. The day she rode into Cedar Ridge, leading the string of polished yearlings, a knot of dread was tangled in her gut. The town was a dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place that had always felt more like a cage than a community. Sheriff Hale was there, as she knew he would be. He wasn't obvious about it. He just leaned against a post outside the saloon, whittling a piece of wood, his eyes following her every move. Potential buyers gathered, their expressions cautious. These were ranchers, men who knew horseflesh. They saw the quality in her animals, the strong lines and clear eyes. But then Hale started his work. He didn't speak to Clara. He just ambled over to a cluster of buyers, his voice a low, carrying drawl. "Mighty fine-looking animals," he'd say, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Shame about the circumstances. A woman alone, and keeping unusual company out at that ranch. Makes a man wonder if what he's buying is sound or safe." The poison spread instantly. The buyers' gazes shifted, now filled with suspicion. They looked from Clara to the horses and back again, their interest curdling into distrust. Their offers, when they came, were insults. They picked at imagined flaws. They spoke of the risk. They tried to use her desperation against her. Clara felt a hot surge of anger. The meek widow who had first faced Hale was gone. In her place was a woman who had survived a killing cold and faced down her own fear. She squared her shoulders, her voice ringing out clear and steady. "These horses are from the Whitfield line," she declared, pitching her voice to Carrie. "My husband's name was known for quality, and I have upheld it. You know a fair price. Pay it, or I'll ride them back home and we'll see who the drought takes first." It was a gamble, a piece of sheer bluff, but her defiance caught them off guard. One rancher, an old man with honest eyes, stepped forward and named a real price. Another followed. She haggled. She countered. She fought for every last dollar, her mind sharp, her resolve like iron. By the time the sun was high, all 6 yearlings were sold. She didn't get what they were worth, not by a long shot, but when she counted the money, her hands trembling slightly, it was enough, just enough to pay the taxes. Her first stop was the telegraph office to wire the money to the territorial capital. Her second was May Henderson's general store. The bell above the door chimed, and the familiar scent of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples enveloped her. Mrs. May. A woman whose face was a roadmap of 60-odd years on the frontier, looked up from behind the counter, her shrewd, kind eyes taking in Clara's dusty clothes and the weary set of her jaw. "Heard you had a tough time of it this morning," May said, wiping down the counter with a damp cloth. "Hale's got a mean streak wide as the Missouri." "I managed," Clara said, pulling her shopping list from her pocket. May finished with her chore and leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Clara, you need to be careful, more than usual. I had some of the railroad surveyors in here yesterday, buying whiskey. They were bragging, said they were remarking the boundaries out your way. Said Pike told them the original surveyor was a drunk and got the lines all wrong." Clara went cold. They were on my land. On what they say is Pike's land now. They moved the stone marker down by the creek, stole 20 acres of your best pasture without firing a shot. The audacity of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just pressure anymore. It was outright theft, sanctioned by the Baron and his hired sheriff. The law wasn't a shield. It was a weapon they were using against her. The wooden boundary post, hammered into the earth by Daniel himself, was a symbol of their life, of their claim. To move it was to desecrate his memory, to try and erase their very existence. As if summoned by the devil himself, the store's bell chimed again. Jonas Pike stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask his rotten core. He smiled when he saw Clara, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Clara, my dear, I saw your little horse sale. A pity you had to part with such fine stock for pocket change." He sauntered over, blocking her path. "It doesn't have to be this way. Allow me to treat you to dinner tonight, at the hotel. We can discuss a more permanent solution to your troubles." Her every instinct screamed no, but she looked at his smug, confident face and realized that knowing your enemy was a weapon in itself. "Fine, Mr. Pike," she said, her voice clipped. "Dinner?" Across the street, Nantan watched the door of the general store. He had followed Clara to town, a silent, unobtrusive shadow. He trusted her skill, but he did not trust this place. He saw Pike enter, and a cold stillness settled over him. When they emerged, minutes later, the set of Clara's jaw told him she had agreed to something she hated. He remained at his post, leaning against the wall of the blacksmith shop, an unmovable fixture of watchful waiting. He did not have to wait long. Sheriff Hale and two of his loutish deputies sauntered across the street, their spurs kicking up dust. They stopped a few feet from Nantan, their expressions a mixture of contempt and curiosity. "Well, look what we have here," Hale drawled, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "Got yourself a long way from the reservation, boy." Nantan said nothing. He didn't even look at them. His gaze was fixed on a point far down the valley, as if they were nothing more than buzzing flies. "Cat got your tongue," one of the deputies sneered. "Or you just forget how to speak English when you ain't hiding behind a woman's skirts." They wanted a reaction. They wanted an excuse. A single shove, a raised fist, would be all they needed to drag him to the town's flimsy jail. Or worse. Nantan remained motionless. He had faced down charging cavalry and cornered bears. These loud, insecure men were nothing. He had learned in the army that true strength was not in the attack, but in the discipline to hold your ground. His stillness was his armor, his silence his weapon. It infuriated them. "Maybe he needs a little persuasion," Hale said, taking a step forward. "I wouldn't, Sheriff." The voice was quiet, but carried an unmistakable authority. Father Morrison stood at the edge of the boardwalk, his black coat dusty, his face etched with weariness. "The man is causing no trouble. I believe the scripture has something to say about bearing false witness against your neighbor." Hale shot the preacher a venomous look, but held his ground. He knew how far he could push. Antagonizing a lone Apache was one thing. Crossing the town's moral compass in public was another. He spat on the ground near Nantan's feet. "This ain't over," he growled, before turning and stalking back to the saloon with his deputies. Father Morrison walked over to Nantan. "That was wise," he said, "but they will not stop. They are looking for a reason." He looked at Nantan, his eyes filled with a deep, pragmatic sadness. "She should hire you, officially, a ranch hand. It's a piece of paper, but in their world, paper matters. It gives you a reason to be there they can't as easily argue with." The dinner at the hotel was an ordeal. The dining room was stuffy, filled with railroad men and speculators. Jonas Pike spoke of his father's grand vision, of a valley transformed by iron and commerce, a valley with no room for small-time ranchers who couldn't see the future. His proposal was no longer veiled. It was a threat. Join us, Clara, or be swept away by the tide. She left as soon as she could, her head pounding. When she got back to the ranch, she found Nantan and Toshin by the fire. The boy was leaning against him, his small face illuminated by the flames. In a quiet, halting voice, prompted by a gentle question from Nantan. He was telling his story. He spoke of soldiers, of his mother Atsa being pushed onto a wagon, of shouting and crying, and of how he had slipped away into the trees and just ran. The story ended, and a heavy silence fell. Nantan put a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. He spoke a few soft words in Apache, a vow that needed no translation. Then he looked at Clara and said in English, "I will find his mother." Clara took a deep breath. She had made her decision. "Nantan," she said, her voice firm, "I need to hire a ranch hand, someone to help with the stock and watch over this land. The pay is next to nothing, room and board, mostly. But the job is yours, if you'll take it." It was Father Morrison's practical advice. But it was also something more. It was a formal declaration of alliance, a line drawn in the dust. He was no longer a shadow, a stranger. He was a part of this place. He looked at her, then at the sleeping boy, and gave a single, solemn nod. Later that night, long after the moon had risen, Clara realized she was out of kerosene for the main lamp, not wanting to wake anyone. She saddled a horse and started the ride back toward Cedar Ridge, hoping May's store might still be lit. She took a familiar shortcut behind the saloon, where the alley was choked with discarded barrels and shadows. As she neared, she heard voices, thick with whiskey, Hale and Jonas Pike. She instantly reined in her horse, pressing herself into the deep darkness of the alley wall. "She's stubborn," Jonas was saying, his voice laced with frustration. "She actually got the tax money. We need to encourage her to see reason." Hale grunted. "What did you have in mind?" There was a pause, and then Jonas's voice, low and chilling. "It's a dry season. Accidents happen. A barn fire, a terrible tragedy. It would be a shame for all that remaining horse stock to be lost. A tragedy that would make the land, shall we say, significantly less valuable." Clara's blood turned to ice. She backed her horse away, silent as a ghost, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't about the law or about money anymore. They were going to destroy everything she had. They were going to burn her home to the ground. The ride back from town was a frantic, desperate flight through the darkness. The words Clara had overheard echoed in her mind. A drumbeat of pure malice asterisk. A barn fire. A terrible tragedy. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. She galloped into the ranch yard, the horse's sides heaving, and threw herself from the saddle before it had even skidded to a stop. Nantan was there in an instant, a silhouette against the starlight, drawn by the sound of her panicked arrival. He saw the look on her face and needed no explanation. "They're coming," she gasped, the words tumbling out. "Hale and Jonas, they're going to burn the barn." He didn't waste time with questions. His gaze swept the darkness, assessing, calculating. When? I don't know. Soon. The helplessness was a physical weight, threatening to crush her. They were two people against a conspiracy of fire and greed. How could they possibly defend this whole valley? "Then we do not wait for them," Nantan said, his voice calm and level in the chaos of her fear. "We give them less to burn." His meaning was clear. They worked through the night in a silent, furious race against a faceless clock. They moved the horses, not into the barn, but out into the farthest pasture, a wide-open space of sparse, dry grass where they would be safer from spreading flames. They hauled buckets of precious water from the nearly dry well, soaking the walls of the small cabin and the wood of the barn itself, until their arms ached and their backs screamed in protest. It was a fool's errand, a child's sandcastle against a coming tide. But it was asterisk something asterisk. It was a refusal to be a passive victim. As the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky a bruised purple, they collapsed in exhaustion. The attack hadn't come. The waiting, Clara realized, was its own form of torment. It was then sitting on the porch steps with hands raw and blistered, that she remembered the map, the secret fire in her pocket. She pulled out the oilcloth, her movements stiff. She showed it to Nantan, her finger tracing the blue line Daniel had drawn. My husband believed there was water, a hidden river, right under our feet. Nantan studied the map, his dark eyes missing nothing. He walked the ground, comparing Daniel's drawing to the rock formations, his feet seeming to read the contours of the earth. He stopped at a spot in the center of the yard, a flat, sun-baked patch of ground midway between the cabin and the barn. He stomped his heel. The sound was hard, solid. Then he knelt, pressing his ear to the ground, closing his eyes. He stayed that way for a full minute, a statue of pure concentration. When he rose, he looked at her. He was right, he said, and in those 3 words, the world shifted. The threat of fire was still there, a shadow lingering at the edge of her thoughts, but now it was eclipsed by a fierce, blazing hope. The well became their obsession, their act of defiance. They found Daniel's old tools in the shed, 2 shovels, a pickaxe, and a bucket on a long rope, and they began to dig. The work was brutal. The sun beat down, turning the air into a furnace. The topsoil was baked hard as brick. The pickaxe rang with a jarring clang each time it struck the earth, sending vibrations up their arms. They took turns, one digging, the other hauling away the dirt, a steady, grueling rhythm. Clara had never known such labor. Her muscles screamed, her palms bled, but she refused to stop. Every swing of the pickaxe was a blow against Jonas Pike. Every shovelful of dirt was a rejection of Sheriff Hale's smug grin. They were not waiting for destruction. They were digging for life. Nantan worked with a tireless strength that awed her. He moved with the earth, not against it, his power coming from a deep, centered place. He taught her how to use her weight, how to breathe, how to find a pace that could be sustained for hours. Toshin watched them, a small, silent observer, bringing them sips of their carefully rationed water, his face a mixture of concern and wonder. He was seeing them build something, and the act of creation was a powerful antidote to the fear that had haunted them all. They dug for 2 days. The hole grew deeper, a perfect circle of dark, cool earth in the middle of the bleached yard. They passed the 6-foot mark, then 10, then 12. The dirt turned from dry dust to something heavier, damper, a faint, loamy smell. The scent of deep earth rose to meet them. Hope was so thick in the air it was almost tangible. Late in the afternoon of the 2nd day, Clara was at the bottom of the hole, her face caked with mud, her clothes soaked with sweat. She swung the pickaxe, and this time, there was no jarring ring of metal on stone. There was a dull, wet asterisk thump asterisk. The ground beneath her feet seemed to soften. She struck it again, harder. A dark, muddy water seeped up around the head of the pick. "Nantan," she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. He was there in a second, peering down into the hole. He lowered the bucket. She filled it not with dirt, but with thick, dark mud. He hauled it up, then lowered it again. This time, when it came up, it was a quarter full of cloudy, miraculous water. He lowered himself into the hole beside her. Together, they dug with their bare hands, scooping away the mud until a small, steady trickle began to flow from the earth. It wasn't a river, it was a seep, a slow, patient offering from the heart of the valley. But it was water. It was life. By evening, the hole had 2 feet of water in the bottom. They worked the pump they'd salvaged from the old well, and after a dozen sputtering, groaning complaints, it caught. A stream of clear, cold water gushed from the spout. Clara laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. She plunged her hands into the stream, splashing her face, letting the impossible coolness wash away the grime and the exhaustion. The horses, drawn by the sound and scent, came to the corral fence, their heads raised, whinnying with a thirst she could finally quench. They filled every trough, every bucket. They drank until their stomachs ached. They had done it. They had found Daniel's secret. That night they fell into their beds, an exhaustion so deep it felt like peace. The threat of pike and hail seemed distant, a problem for another day. Tonight they had water. Tonight they had won. The smell of smoke woke Clara from a dead sleep. For a moment, she was disoriented, her mind thick with sleep. Then the smell registered, acrid and terrifying. She shot out of bed. An angry, orange light flickered against her window. She threw open the cabin door and her heart stopped. The hay barn was an inferno. Flames, 50 feet high, clawed at the night sky. A roaring, monstrous beast devouring the building whole. The heat was a physical blow, even from 100 feet away. They had done it. The cowards had waited until they were asleep, until they were celebrating their small victory, and they had come to burn it all down. Nantan was already outside, a bucket in each hand, his face a grim mask in the hellish light. The horses, he yelled over the roar. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. The main herd was safe in the far pasture, but she'd brought 3 mares, heavy with foal, into the smaller corral near the barn for the night. They were trapped, screaming in terror, their eyes wide and white as they reared against the fence, trapped between their enclosure and the terrifying heat. Adrenaline surged through her. She grabbed buckets and ran to the new well, working the pump handle with a frantic strength she didn't know she possessed. Nantan was already at the corral, trying to soothe the terrified animals, his low voice a steady counterpoint to the fire's rage. They threw bucket after bucket of water onto the corral fence, trying to keep the flames from jumping the gap. The fire was too hot, too fast. Embers rained down around them, small, burning stars that ignited the dry grass wherever they landed. It was then that she heard the cough, a small, weak sound from the cabin. Toshin. Smoke, thick and black, was pouring from the cabin's open door, the wind having shifted, driving the choking cloud directly toward the small building. She had been so focused on the barn, on the horses, that she hadn't seen the new danger. "Toshin!" she screamed, dropping her bucket. She ran for the cabin, but Nantan was faster. He moved like a shadow, a blur of motion through the chaos. He covered his face with his wet bandana and plunged into the smoke-filled doorway without hesitation. An eternity passed in the space of a few seconds. Clara stood frozen, screaming the boy's name, her heart seizing with a terror far greater than any fear for her land or her life. Then, Nantan emerged from the smoke, striding through the doorway as if from the mouth of hell itself. In his arms, he carried Toshin, who was coughing and sputtering, but alive. He carried the boy clear of the smoke, laying him on the grass, his touch gentle, his face fierce with a protective fire that burned hotter than the barn. The world narrowed to that small circle on the grass. Clara knelt, pulling the boy into her arms, murmuring his name over and over. He was alive. He was safe. The barn, the fences, the hay, it was all just wood and grass. This small, breathing child was everything. The fight went out of them. The barn was a lost cause. They could only watch as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks, the main timbers groaning as they gave way. They focused on dousing the small grass fires, stamping them out, beating them with wet sacks until, as the sun rose on a scene of devastation, the last of the flames died. The morning light revealed the full extent of the wreckage. The barn was a skeleton of blackened, smoldering timbers. The air was thick with the stink of wet ash and defeat. It was in this gray, grim landscape that a buggy appeared, rattling up the road. It was Dr. Fowler, his face grim, his medical bag on the seat beside him. May Henderson must have seen the glow from town and sent him. He checked Toshin first, pronouncing him clear of any serious harm from the smoke. He cleaned and bandaged a burn on Clara's arm she hadn't even realized she'd gotten. He looked from the ruins of the barn to the new well, then to the determined set of Clara's jaw. "This wasn't an accident," he said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Clara said, her voice hard as stone. The fear and despair of the night had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard rage. "And I'm not going to let them get away with it. I'm filing a complaint. I'm suing them for damages." "Doctor," Fowler nodded slowly, "it will be your word against the sheriff and the richest man in the territory. Clara, you'll need more than a good story. You'll need proof." As the doctor was leaving, Nantan spoke, his voice quiet. "The proof is here." He walked over to the place where the fire had been set, a spot near the main doors where a pile of oil-soaked rags had been thrown against the wall. The rest of them had only seen the fire. Nantan, with the eyes of a scout, saw the story written in the ashes. He knelt, pointing. "They came on horseback. 3 of them," he said, gesturing to the faint hoof prints in the dust. Prints that had been preserved from the main fury of the flames by a slight rise in the ground. 2 of the horses are shod with standard shoes, but this one, he traced the outline of a print with his finger. "This one is different. The right forefoot. The shoe has a nick in the outside edge, a V shape, a careless blacksmith, or a stone cut. It is a clear mark." He moved from the hoof prints to the scorched earth, his eyes scanning the ground. He picked up a half-burnt piece of what looked like a cigar. "And this, it is an expensive cigar, not the kind the local hands smoke." Clara stared at the print in the dust. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Jonas Pike at the general store, leaning against the post, one foot hooked behind the other. She remembered the sunlight glinting off his expensive, polished boots, and off the silver concho on his saddle. And she remembered seeing his horse, a big, black gelding, lifting its forefoot. She had idly noticed its shoe, a small, V-shaped nick in the outer rim. She looked at Nantan, her eyes wide. He knew. He had just handed her the weapon she needed. The ashes of her barn were not the end of her story. They were the proof of the truth. They had tried to bury her in ruin, but they had only succeeded in giving her the evidence to dig her way out. Filing a lawsuit in a town like Cedar Ridge was like trying to lasso a whirlwind. There was no courthouse, no robed judge, only a dusty grain warehouse and the town's portly mayor, Elias Thorne, who had been pressed into service as a justice of the peace. Thorne was a man who valued commerce over conflict, and he looked deeply uncomfortable sitting on a makeshift bench behind a table laden with property deeds and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. The entire town seemed to be crammed into the cavernous space. The air was thick with the smell of grain dust, sweat, and simmering resentment. The spectators were a jury of whispers, their loyalties visibly divided. On one side stood the ranchers and small folk who had felt the railroad's boot on their own necks, their faces grim and watchful. On the other were the railroad employees, the saloon loafers, and those who profited from Baron Pike's patronage, their expressions ranging from smug to openly hostile. Jonas Pike sat near the front with 2 of his father's lawyers, looking bored and untouchable. Sheriff Hale stood by his side, his hand resting on his pistol, a tin star on a corrupt heart. Clara stood before them, Nantan at her side. She had insisted he be there, not as a witness at first, but as her partner in this fight. His presence was a silent declaration that she would not be intimidated. "Mayor Thorne," Clara began, her voice clearer and stronger than she'd felt it could be. "On the night of the 14th, my hay barn was intentionally set on fire. My life and the life of the child in my care were endangered. I am here to accuse Jonas Pike and Sheriff Hale of arson and conspiracy to drive me from my land." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jonas Pike chuckled softly, as if at a child's fanciful tale. Hale stepped forward, his expression one of theatrical disbelief. "This is an outrage. This woman has no proof, only the word of—" He turned and pointed a dramatic finger at Nantan. "Of this man, an Apache vagrant, a former army scout who was dismissed for his—" aggressive tendencies. How can we trust the word of a man bred for savagery? The poison in his words was potent. Clara saw the faces of some townsfolk harden with prejudice. She saw the fear in others. Hale was playing his strongest card. "I have more than his word," Clara countered, her voice ringing with newfound authority. She presented a carefully sketched drawing. "This is a rendering of a hoof print found at the scene. It shows a distinctive V-shaped nick on the right foreshoe, a mark that I, and others, can testify is on Mr. Pike's black gelding." She then held up the half-burnt cigar. "And this was found in the tinder. I doubt many ranch hands in this valley can afford Mr. Pike's brand." The evidence was circumstantial, but it was solid. The murmuring grew louder. Jonas's smile faltered for the first time. Before the mayor could respond, May Henderson pushed her way through the crowd, her account ledger held in front of her like a shield. "Elias," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, "you know my books are square. I've never cheated a soul in 30 years. "Of course, May," the mayor said, looking relieved to see a friendly face. "Well," she said, flipping open the ledger to a marked page. "The night of the fire. Not an hour before it started. Sheriff Hale came into my store. He bought 5 gallons of kerosene, said it was for cleaning engine parts." She produced a slip of paper from the book. "Here's the receipt. He paid in cash. I thought it was odd. In the 10 years he's been sheriff, he's never bought more than a pint of kerosene at a time." A collective gasp went through the crowd. All eyes turned to Hale, whose face had gone pale beneath his sun-weathered skin. He was trapped in a lie of his own making, exposed by a simple, honest ledger. He was stocking up for the station house," Hale stammered. "Then the station house must be mighty greasy," May retorted dryly, and a few nervous chuckles broke the tension. Next, Father Morrison stepped forward, his expression pained, as if he were about to perform a painful but necessary surgery. "I don't like to speak ill of any man," he began, his quiet voice demanding silence, "but truth has a claim on us all. A few weeks ago, in the saloon, I heard Mr. Pike speaking with the sheriff after Mrs. Whitfield had refused one of his offers. I heard Mr. Pike say, and I quote, 'If she won't listen to reason, perhaps we should let fire do the dirty work.' The accusation, coming from the town's preacher, landed like a physical blow." Jonas Pike shot to his feet. "That's a lie. The old man is confused." But the damage was done. The tide of opinion was turning. A slow, heavy thing, but it was turning. It was Clara's moment. She stepped into the center of the room, her gaze sweeping over her neighbors. "This isn't just about my barn," she said, her voice resonating with a passion that came from the very core of her being. "This is about my water, the well my husband and I dug. It's about the boundary stone they moved in the dead of night to steal my pasture. It's about every one of you who has been squeezed and threatened, and told that your home is worth less than a railroad tie." She pointed to the new well, visible through the warehouse's open doors. "They tried to burn me out because I found my own water. They don't want us to have our own water, our own land, our own lives. They want us to be dependent. They want us to be afraid, but I am not just fighting for my home. I am fighting for the right to have a home at all." The ranchers and farmers looked at one another, a dawning recognition in their eyes. She was speaking their language, their fears, their secret resentments. Mayor Thorne, looking increasingly overwhelmed, turned to Nantan. "And you, sir, Hale claims you are a dangerous man. What have you to say?" Nantan stepped forward. He did not look at Hale. He looked at the faces in the crowd, the anxious, the angry, the fearful. He was no longer a shadow. He was a presence. He had become his name. "I have seen my home taken," he said, his English slow but powerful, each word carefully chosen. "I have seen my people, the Chiricahua, marched from the lands where my ancestors are buried. We were not driven out by fire, but by soldiers and pieces of paper with lies written on them. The pain is the same. A man's home is his heart. The man who steals it is a thief. It does not matter what language the man speaks or what color his skin is. He finally turned his gaze to Hale, his eyes like black flint. You call me a savage because I would defend this woman's home, but I am here because I believe in justice, and justice should not have a color. It was a speech unlike any they had ever heard. It shamed the prejudice in the room, elevating the conflict from a simple land dispute to a question of universal morality. But Hale, desperate, saw one last opening. Noble words, he sneered, from a man who stalks lone women in the wilderness. Before Clara could stop herself, she moved. She walked to the bench where Nantan had left his deerskin poncho. She picked it up, the worn, soft leather a familiar weight in her hands. She held it up for all to see. Sheriff Hale calls this man a stalker, she said, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the warehouse. I want to tell you what kind of stalker he is. The room went completely silent. Weeks ago, I was in the mountains, desperate for water. I found a secluded waterfall. I was alone, and I was bathing. A shocked whisper went through the crowd. She ignored it, her eyes locked on the mayor. This man came upon me by accident. He saw me, and in that moment, when I was at my most vulnerable, he did not stare. He did not approach. He turned his back instantly. He walked away. And he left this. She held the poncho higher on a rock near my clothes, so that I could cover myself and keep my dignity. She let the words hang in the air. A truth so simple and powerful, it dwarfed all of Hale's blustering accusations. That is the character of this man, she finished, her voice thick with emotion. He protected my honor when no one was watching. Jonas Pike and Sheriff Hale tried to destroy my home when they thought no one was watching. Now, you tell me, Mayor, who are the savages here? It was over. The collective soul of the town had shifted. The faces that had been hostile were now filled with shame. The faces that had been fearful were now filled with a dawning courage. They turned as one to look at Hale and Pike, and what the two men saw in their eyes was a verdict far more damning than any the mayor could deliver. Mayor Thorne, seeing the will of the people, finally found his spine. He banged a hammer he'd grabbed from a nearby toolbox on the table. Order, order. He stood, puffing out his chest. In light of this testimony, Sherman Hale, I find you complicit in this cowardly act. I hereby strip you of your office and your badge. You are under arrest. Two burly ranchers stepped forward, pulling the star from Hale's chest and grabbing his arms. For the first time, raw fear showed on the ex-sheriff's face. And I am issuing a warrant for the immediate arrest of Jonas Pike on the charge of conspiracy and arson, the mayor declared. But as the ranchers turned toward Jonas, the chair where he had been sitting was empty. In the commotion of Hale's arrest, he had vanished. A man burst in through the back door of the warehouse. He's gone, the man yelled. Pike, he slipped out the back, rode out of town like the devil was on his tail. Heading west, he swore he'd be back, and that next time, he'd bring enough hired guns to burn Cedar Ridge to the ground. A cold dread replaced the triumphant mood in the room. They had won the battle of truth, but in doing so, they had just started a war. The victory in the grain warehouse felt like a fragile truce, not a lasting peace. Jonas Pike's final threat hung over Cedar Ridge like the shadow of a hawk, a promise of violence that made the air feel thin and brittle. Every day was a holding of breath. Clara and Nantan worked to rebuild, their hammers echoing in the valley as they framed a new, smaller stable. But their eyes were constantly scanning the horizon. The community, emboldened by their stand, offered help. Men came to raise the timbers, and women brought food, their actions a quiet rebellion against the Pike dynasty. But everyone knew this was just the calm before a more violent storm. The storm, when it came, was not the one they expected. It arrived not on horseback with guns blazing, but from the sky, a silent, creeping thief of warmth. An unseasonably early snow began to fall. soft and deceptively gentle at first. Clara, Nantan, and Toshin had ridden up to the high pastures to drive the main herd down into a sheltered canyon. The first flakes were a curiosity, melting on the horses' manes. Within an hour, they were fighting their way through a blinding, swirling wall of white. The world dissolved. The sky and the earth became one, a maelstrom of wind and ice. The temperature plummeted, and the wind had a razor's edge, cutting through their coats and chilling them to the bone. They were cut off, hopelessly lost. The ranch was an impossible dream miles away. "There's a line shack," Clara yelled over the shriek of the wind, her words nearly torn from her lips. "An old shepherd's hut, east of here." Nantan, his face a grim mask against the cold, nodded. He knew the place. He took the lead, his uncanny sense of direction their only compass in the whiteout. They huddled together, Toshin wrapped in a blanket between them on Clara's horse, and pushed on. The shack, when they finally stumbled upon it, was little more than a dark smudge against the snow. It was a small, one-room cabin of rough-hewn logs, half buried in a drift. But to them, it was a palace. They managed to get the horses into a small, three-sided lean-to behind the shack before plunging into the relative quiet of the interior. The cold inside was almost as bitter as it was outside, but at least they were shielded from the wind's relentless assault. The shack was bare, containing only a crude stone fireplace, a rickety table, and 2 bunks built into the wall. Their supplies were meager: a few strips of jerky, a half-full canteen, and the coffee and hardtack in their saddlebags. It was barely enough for one day, let alone a siege by a blizzard. Nantan, with his customary efficiency, scraped together what little dry kindling he could find in the corners of the shack and coaxed a small, sputtering fire to life in the hearth. It was a pitiful thing, a fistful of warmth against an ocean of cold, but it was the center of their world. They huddled around it, the flickering light of their single storm lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. Outside, the storm howled like a hungry wolf. Hours bled into one another. The world became the small, dark room, the sound of the wind, and the creeping, insidious cold that the fire could not keep at bay. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped to a level that was not just uncomfortable, but lethal. Toshin, wrapped in every blanket they had, was still shivering. He had taken to calling Clara Auntie Clara in the weeks since the fire, a term of endearment that both warmed and broke her heart. Now, he looked at her with wide, fearful eyes. "It's so cold, Auntie Clara," he whispered, his teeth chattering. Clara pulled him closer, but her own body offered little warmth. She was shivering herself, her hands and feet numb. She looked at Nantan. He sat across the small fire, stoic and still, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way he held his arms tightly around himself. Their situation was dire. The fire was dying, their fuel almost gone. Just like that night in the mountains, they would have to share their warmth to survive. But this was different. The trust between them now was a deep and proven thing, a bedrock forged in fire and testimony. She didn't need to ask this time. She simply moved, shifting the pile of blankets to the floor in front of the hearth, creating a single nest. "Come," she said softly to Nantan. "We must." He met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw not hesitation, but a deep, somber understanding. He moved to the nest, sitting with his back against a rolled-up saddle. Clara lay down, pulling the shivering Toshin against her. Then she shifted, resting her back against Nantan's solid chest, fitting herself into the space he made for her. The 3 of them became a single unit, a small island of life against the storm. Nantan wrapped the last blanket around all of them, his arm resting over her, a gesture of pure, practical protection. The immediate relief was profound. The shared heat began to push back the deadly chill. Toshin, sandwiched between them, finally stopped shivering and drifted into an exhausted sleep. In the near darkness, with only the faint glow of the lantern and the dying embers, the world fell away, leaving only the sound of the wind and the quiet intimacy of their breathing. The physical closeness broke down a final barrier, opening a space for words that could only be spoken in a whisper. "Sometimes," Clara began, her voice barely audible, "I still expect to hear his boots on the porch. Daniel's. The confession was a ghost, a wisp of vapor in the cold air. When he passed, the silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I thought I would be alone in that silence forever." She felt the steady, slow beat of Nantan's heart against her back. It was a comforting, living rhythm. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just listened. "I was so afraid," she continued, the words coming easier now. "Afraid of the debt, the drought, the loneliness. But mostly, I was afraid of forgetting what it felt like to not be afraid, to feel safe." She felt his hand, warm and calloused. Find hers under the blanket. He didn't squeeze or caress, he just held it. A simple, solid connection. "Fear is a companion on a long journey," he said, his voice a low murmur near her ear. "It is not a thing to be ashamed of." He was quiet for a long time, and she thought he might say no more. But then he spoke again. "When the soldiers came for my people, I was a scout. I was away. When I returned, they were gone. All of them. My sister, my mother, Atsa." He said Toshin's mother's name with a reverence that was also a wound. "I see their faces when I sleep, the ones I was supposed to protect, the ones who trusted me. I wear the name spokesman, but I was not there to speak for them. The guilt is a cold thing. It lives in the bones." She understood then. They were both haunted, she by a silence, he by a chorus of ghosts. She turned her head slightly, her cheek brushing against the rough wool of his shirt. "You saved Toshin," she whispered. "You saved us from the fire. You spoke for all of us at the trial. Your name is true, Nantan." His grip on her hand tightened for a brief moment. They lay in silence for a long time after that. But it was no longer the crushing silence of loneliness. It was a shared quiet, a space of mutual healing. They were two survivors, from two different worlds, finding shelter not just from a storm, but from the wreckage of their own pasts. The intimacy between them was not about desire. It was about recognition. It was the profound and courageous act of letting another soul see your scars. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the walls, Clara felt a subtle shift in the air. The relentless howl of the wind was softening, dying down to a mournful sigh. The storm was breaking. "When this is over," she whispered, not wanting to break the spell, "when the snow melts, we will talk," he finished for her. It was not a question. It was a promise, a boundary for now, and a doorway to a future they couldn't yet imagine. The day passed in a slow, tired haze. By the next morning, the storm had passed completely, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The silence was absolute, breathtaking. Nantan was the first to go outside, wading through the thigh-deep snow to check on the horses, who were thankfully safe, huddled and frosty in the lean-to. Clara followed him out, shielding her eyes against the brilliant, blinding glare of the sun on the snow. The air was clean and cold, tasting of pine and renewal. For a moment, it felt like a new beginning, a world washed clean. And then Nantan stopped dead. He was staring at the ground, his body tensed. Clara followed his gaze. There, in the otherwise untouched canvas of snow, was a set of tracks. They were not their own. They were from a single, shod horse. They circled the shack in a wide, deliberate arc, the prints deep and clear in the new snow. The rider had come during the night, while the storm still raged. They had watched the shack, a silent, menacing sentinel in the blizzard. The tracks then led away, disappearing into the trees, heading west. The feeling of peace shattered. replaced by an icy dread that had nothing to do with the cold. The war had not been postponed. It had followed them here. Jonas Pike's hired guns were no longer a distant threat. They were out there, in the woods, and they knew exactly where to find them. The journey back from the line shack was a descent into a changed world. The snow, beautiful and silent from a distance, was a treacherous, exhausting obstacle. Every step was a struggle. The ominous tracks they had found were a constant, unspoken presence between them, a promise of violence lurking beneath the pristine white landscape. They pushed the horses hard, a sense of urgency coiling in their guts. The sun was a pale disk in a hazy sky, and a thick ground mist began to rise as they neared the valley floor, shrouding the familiar landmarks in an ethereal, ghostly veil. They saw the ranch at dawn. The half-built stable was a dark skeleton against the snow, the cabin a lonely sentinel. A plume of smoke rose from their chimney, a fire they had not set. The first shot was a sharp, flat crack that ripped the morning silence to shreds. A spray of snow erupted just feet from Nantan's horse. Ambush. "Get down." Nantan's voice was not a yell, but a low, urgent command. He slid from his saddle, pulling his rifle free, and melted into a cluster of snow-dusted boulders before Clara had even processed the attack. Clara reacted on pure instinct. She yanked her horse's reins, pulling the animal and the terrified Toshin behind the solid cover of the woodpile. Another shot whizzed past her head with an angry buzz. They were pinned down, exposed. The attackers were hidden in the mist-shrouded rocks on the ridge overlooking the ranch, the same ridge from which Nantan had once watched her. "The cabin," Nantan called out, his voice seeming to come from the rocks themselves. "Get the boy inside. I'll give you cover." He fired twice, the rifle's report echoing across the valley. The shots were not aimed to kill, but to suppress, to force the unseen gunmen to keep their heads down. Clara didn't hesitate. She scooped Toshin from the saddle, his small body rigid with fear, and ran, her boots sinking deep in the snow. She ran a broken, zigzagging path, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cabin's door, the only goal in her universe. The air sang around her as bullets tore through the space she had just occupied. She threw herself through the doorway, landing hard on the rough plank floor with Toshin shielded beneath her. She scrambled to the window, her father's heavy shotgun in her hands. Peering through the grimy glass, she could see nothing but swirling mist and the vague, dark shapes of rocks. The fight was a battle of sounds and shadows, the sharp crack of the ambushers' rifles, the deeper boom of Nantan's, and the terrifying whistle of lead cutting the air. Nantan was a ghost in the snow. He moved from rock to tree to the half-finished stable, never staying in one place for more than a moment. He was using the terrain, the poor visibility, his scout's knowledge of every dip and fold in the land, to make one man seem like five. He was drawing their fire, making them reveal their positions. A muzzle flash from a high cluster of rocks gave one of them away. Before the shooter could fire again, Nantan's rifle spoke. A single, choked cry echoed from the ridge, and then silence from that position. One down. Clara's role was to watch the direct approach to the cabin. Her shotgun was useless at long range, but devastating up close. She was the last line of defense for the boy, who was now huddled under the table, his hands over his ears. She was no longer a victim waiting for a fire. She was a soldier defending her home. The fight seemed to stretch for an eternity. The mist swirled, offering fleeting glimpses of the battlefield. Then, through a thinning patch, she saw him, Jonas Pike. He wasn't on the ridge with the shooters. He was on horseback at the edge of the property, near the new well, a rifle in his hands. He wasn't even looking at the fight. He was looking at the well's pump, its iron handle stark against the snow. A cold, horrifying realization dawned on her. He wasn't here to kill them. He was here to kill her hope, to destroy the water that was the lifeblood of her ranch, the symbol of her defiance. "Nantan!" she screamed, her voice raw. "The well, it's Jonas!" As if in answer, A new sound reached them, the frantic ringing of a bell from the direction of town, followed by the distant shouts of men. A posse. May must have sent for help the moment she heard the first shots echo down the valley. They were coming, but they were too far away. Jonas heard it too. He knew his time was short. He raised his rifle, taking aim not at the cabin, not at Nantan, but at the heart of the well. In that split second, Clara didn't think. She acted. She burst from the cabin door, leaving the relative safety of its walls, and ran toward the well, placing her own body between Jonas and his target. It was an insane, suicidal act, born of a love for her home that was fiercer than her fear of death. "No!" she screamed, her arms spread wide, a human shield for a hole in the ground. She saw the flash from Jonas's rifle. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to the small, dark muzzle and the space between them. Then, a force like a charging bull slammed into her from the side. Nantan, his face a mask of furious desperation, had abandoned his cover and launched himself at her. He tackled her, driving her down into the soft, deep snow just as the bullet tore through the air where she had been standing. The heavy slug slammed into the wooden pump handle, shattering it into splinters. Jonas cursed, trying to lever another round into his rifle, but his horse, spooked by the gunshot and the sudden movement, shied violently on the icy ground near the well's trough. Its hooves went out from under it. The animal went down with a terrified squeal. Throwing Jonas from the saddle, he landed hard, his rifle flying from his grasp, and lay stunned in the snow. It was over. The remaining hired guns on the ridge, seeing their employer down and the posse now visible in the distance, melted away into the wilderness. The new sheriff, a young, earnest man named Miller, was the first to arrive, his face grim. His posse, a motley collection of ranchers and townsfolk, surrounded the groaning Jonas Pike and hauled him to his feet. Clara was still on the ground, Nantan kneeling beside her, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with adrenaline and fear. "No," she whispered, her body trembling. "You saved me." He helped her to her feet, his grip on her arm steady and strong. They stood there, surrounded by the townsfolk, by the evidence of the battle, and looked at their home. It was scarred but standing. The well, its handles shattered, was still there, a promise of life flowing deep beneath the frozen ground. The climax, however, was not the capture of a coward in the snow. It happened 2 hours later. The entire posse had escorted Jonas back to the ranch, a prisoner in his own intended war zone. And then another buggy appeared. This one far grander than Dr. Fowler's, pulled by 2 magnificent gray horses. Baron Pike had arrived, his face a thundercloud of arrogant fury. His lawyers in tow, he had come not to surrender, but to collect his son, expecting to smooth everything over with money and threats. He was not met by a lone widow. He was met by the entire community of Cedar Ridge. They stood in a silent, determined semicircle in her yard. May Henderson, Father Morrison, Dr. Fowler, and every rancher whose land bordered the railroad's path. "This is an outrage," the Baron boomed, his voice accustomed to instant obedience. "I demand you release my son immediately." "Your son tried to commit murder, Baron," Sheriff Miller said, his hand resting on his pistol, "after burning this woman's barn to the ground." "Lies and slander," one of the lawyers snapped. It was Clara who stepped forward, Nantan, a silent, solid presence just behind her. She was no longer afraid of this man. "Your son shot at me, Mr. Pike. He tried to destroy my well. Your sheriff tried to steal my land. Your campaign of terror in this valley is over." "You have no proof," the Baron roared. "We have a confession," Miller said calmly. "The hired man we'd found on the ridge decided to talk in exchange for a lighter sentence. He named Jonas. He named Hale. And he named you as the one paying for it all." The Baron's face went white. He looked from the sheriff to the hard, unyielding faces of the ranchers. He saw no fear. He saw no one he could buy. He had lost. "What do you want?" he finally snarled, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "We want justice," May Henderson said, stepping forward. "And justice has a price. You will pay to rebuild Clara's barn. Twice what it was worth. You will pay for the livestock she lost, and that's just the start." Father Morrison continued, his voice quiet but firm. "You will sign a new deed, witnessed by all of us, guaranteeing Clara Whitfield's property lines are permanent and incontestable. And you will do the same for every homesteader whose land your railroad touches in this valley. You will sign a guarantee to respect their boundaries. Forever." It was a staggering demand. It was a revolution. They were using his own tactics, the law, the power of a binding document against him. They were forcing him to protect the very people he had tried to crush. Baron Pike stared at them, his empire crumbling around him in a snowy ranch yard. He looked at his son, a pathetic, defeated figure held between two grim-faced farmers. He had no choice. "Draw up the papers," he bit out, his voice choked with rage. As the makeshift documents were being written on the hood of the Baron's buggy, a small group of people who had followed the posse from town arrived. They were a mix of townsfolk and a few native families who lived on the fringes of the territory. And among them was a woman, an Apache woman with haunted, hopeful eyes, who stopped and stared at the small boy standing beside Clara. The woman whispered a name, a sound like a prayer. Toshin. The boy, who had been clinging to Clara's leg, looked up. His eyes widened. A flicker of a memory, a ghost of a connection, crossed his face. He took a hesitant step forward. Nantan turned, his stoic composure finally breaking. He looked at the woman, and a lifetime of searching and sorrow was in his voice when he spoke her name. Atsa. It was her, Toshin's mother, his cousin. She ran forward, falling to her knees in the snow, her arms open. Toshin ran to her, a small, stumbling run that ended in an embrace of reunion and relief. He was home. Clara watched, tears streaming down her face, her heart breaking and healing all at once. The battle was won. The land was safe. The community had found its strength. But true justice, she realized, wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about making families whole again. Spring did not arrive in the valley. It was born from it. The great silence of the snow gave way to 1,000 small sounds of life, the trickle of melting ice, the cheerful chirp of a returning sparrow, the soft sigh of the earth taking its first green breath. The blackened skeleton of the old barn was gone, replaced by a sturdy new stable, its fresh pine timbers smelling of resilience and community. The men who had raised its frame were the same men who had stood with Clara in her yard, facing down a barren. Clara's life had found a new rhythm, one not dictated by survival, but by purpose. A corner of the new stable had been walled off, fitted with a potbelly stove, a slate board, and 3 long benches. This was the Cedar Ridge School. Her students were a testament to the changes in the valley. The freckled sons of ranchers sat beside the shy daughters of railroad workers. And twice a week, Atsa brought Toshin and 3 other Apache children down from their small, newly settled camp in the foothills. Clara taught them letters and sums. But more than that, she taught them that a neighbor was not defined by the land they owned or the language they spoke at home. The school, like the new well, had become a source of life for the valley. Nantan had found his own peace, not in settlement, but in motion. The county, under the guidance of the earnest Sheriff Miller, had created a new position, Territorial Ranger. It was a title they invented for a man they could not define. Nantan was a guide, a guardian of the forests and waterways, and a bridge. He patrolled the vast wilderness, his presence a deterrent to the kind of lawlessness that had nearly consumed them. He ensured the railroad survey crews adhered to the new, legally binding boundaries. And he became an advocate for his own people, ensuring their rights to fish and hunt in their traditional grounds were respected. He had not returned to a reservation. He had helped create a space where his people could coexist with dignity. He was, at last, a spokesman for peace. Toshin was thriving. He was a bright, laughing boy, healed by the fierce love of his mother and the steady affection of the woman he still called Auntie Clara. He was a child of two worlds, as comfortable with a reading primer as he was with tracking a rabbit through the woods with Nantan. He was the valley's future, a living symbol of its hard-won harmony. One afternoon, as Clara was preparing supper, Nantan rode in. It had been nearly a week since she'd seen him. He brought news and a quiet question in his eyes. "The creek is running high," he said, accepting a dipper of cool water from the well. "And the spring near Atsa's camp. It has never been so full. The elders say the mountain is giving back the water it held during the drought." Clara smiled, a slow, knowing smile. She looked at the well, at its new, sturdy oak handle. Perhaps the mountain had a little help. Their secret lay between them, the gentle twist of fate that Daniel's map had revealed. The underground river that fed her well continued on, seeping through the granite heart of the valley to replenish the very springs the Apache had relied on for generations. Their sources of life were, and always had been, connected. They were drinking from the same water. They ate together on the porch as the sun bled color into the western sky. The promise they had made in the snowbound shack, the promise to talk, had been honored not with a single conversation, but in 1,000 small ways over the past months. It was in the way he repaired her porch step without being asked, and the way she saved him the last of the coffee. It was a language of quiet care, of deep unstated understanding. "Atsa is taking Toshin to visit the high country for the summer," Nantan said, breaking the comfortable silence, "to teach him the old ways, the old stories." "He will like that," Clara said softly. "He has a strong heart, like his mother and his uncle." Nantan looked at her, his gaze direct, steady. The time for unspoken things was passing. "My work as ranger is good. Atsa and her people are safe. The valley is at peace. But my path, it is still the path of a lone man." Clara's heart stilled. This was it, the doorway they had acknowledged in the storm. She could let him walk through it alone, back into the wilderness that was his home. Or she could ask him to stay. But she knew that wasn't the right way. Their entire story had been about consent, about choices freely made. "Is that the path you choose?" "Nantan," she asked, her voice even, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the last sliver of sun disappear behind the mountains. "I have walked alone for a long time," he said. "It is a hard habit to break, but I find my feet seem to bring me back to this porch, to this well. I am no longer just searching for what I have lost. I am thinking of what I might build." He stood up and held out his hand. "Walk with me." They didn't speak as he led her away from the ranch, up the familiar trail into the foothills. The air grew cooler, scented with pine and damp earth. The moon was rising, a silver coin in a velvet sky. She knew where they were going. She heard the murmur of water before she saw it. The waterfall. It was transformed. The spring thaw had turned the gentle cascade into a powerful, joyous torrent, thundering into the deep pool, throwing up a spray of moonlit mist. It was a place of rebirth, washed clean of all its old ghosts. Clara had brought a bundle with her, a thick wool blanket she had woven herself over the long winter months, its pattern a simple design of river blue and earth brown. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, the same clearing where he had once left his poncho for her. He stood by the water's edge, his back to her, a solitary figure against the raw power of nature. He was waiting. He was giving her the choice, just as he had done that first day. The choice to approach or to walk away. She did not walk away. She stepped up behind him, her boots silent on the damp moss. She unfolded the heavy blanket. It was not a gesture of modesty or of shame. It was a declaration. She gently draped it over his shoulders. the soft wool settling around him like an embrace. He turned, his eyes questioning in the soft light. She rested her hands on his chest, feeling the steady, familiar beat of his heart beneath her palms. Her voice, when she spoke, was a whisper meant only for him, a sound nearly lost in the roar of the falls. "That day, you turned away to preserve my dignity," she said, her gaze locked with his. "Tonight, I willingly choose to stay." The last barrier between them dissolved in that moment. He gathered her into his arms, and it was not the desperate, practical embrace against a killing cold, but the sure, quiet embrace of a man coming home. He was her guardian, her ally, her friend. He was the man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and shown her only honor. And she was the woman who had looked past the savage the world wanted her to see and found the spokesman for justice, the heart that beat in time with her own. They stood there for a long time, held in the sanctuary of the waterfall's mist, two solitudes that had found a shared peace. Far below, in the valley, the lights of the ranch and the small camp in the foothills twinkled back at the stars. A little way down the path, sitting on a log and sharing a story in the moonlight, were a mother and her son, their laughter a faint, happy sound on the night air. The water from the falls flowed down into the valley, feeding the secret river, connecting them all in its deep, life-giving embrace. The future was unwritten, but for the first time, it felt like a story they would write together. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please let us know in the comments below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And to help this story be heard by more people, please support us by hitting the hype button